and welcome to the second video in week 1 for the bioethics class. The first video was just an introduction to the course mechanics and how you're going to be graded, what you have to do. And now I'm going to start introducing you to the course content. So in the discussion forum, you should have introduced yourself. And I wanted you to respond to a hypothetical situation. I asked, would you feel wronged if someone had used a tissue sample that was taken from your body for profit without your permission? And hopefully we got some good discussion there. I'm just going to share some typical answers from previous semesters. So last 72 people who answered this question. Of them, 19 said that they didn't feel wronged at all. 40 said they felt wrong because consent wasn't given. And then an additional 13 said they felt wrong because consent wasn't given and there was money involved. So in the first category, people said things like, as long as the tumor is sold for medical purposes, I'm okay with it. I would not be offended if that money was turned back into the system versus the doctor just spending the money. I think the idea is that people are actually happy to see their body tissues go to advanced medical science. People want to advance medical science and they're happy to participate. The majority of people, though, are upset about the consent, the lack of consent. Yes, because the experiment studies were kept secret. If the doctor had been more upfront, it would have been different. And that's a typical attitude because consent is generally thought to be crucial for morality, all sorts of aspects of morality, but in particular medical ethics. All right. And then finally, some people not only were upset about the consent, but also were upset that money was involved. I do like that I got charged for treatment and no money from the tissue bank, that the person said sarcastically. Or, it's part of my body, so I feel entitled to some of that money. Well, this scenario isn't entirely a hypothetical. It isn't a hypothetical at all. It is what happened to a woman named Henrietta Lacks decades and decades ago. And it'll be the topic of our readings in this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So today, for this video, I'm not assuming that you've started to read the book yet, but I want to provide some background concepts that will help us understand the story of Henrietta Lacks that we are reading in this book. So the video is called Bioethics Through the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So bioethics, that's the name of this course. You might want to know what we're talking about. Bioethics is just the study of ethical issues that come up in medicine and the life sciences. There are fancier ways of defining it or thinking about it, but that's all we're going to worry about, right? So bioethics is a branch of philosophy. And as such, it involves a lot of big, abstract, philosophical ideas. This is the ethics part of bioethics. And in this course, the three main abstract ideas that I want to focus on are justice, autonomy, and knowledge. And so that's where the philosophical content of the course comes in. That's what we're going to be thinking about, just the nature of these ideas. But we also are going to be thinking about practical ethical issues, things in the real world that you will encounter. One that's actually important right now, it's been in the news more at least, medical racism. The central one is the one that we were just talking about, ownership of tissues and medical information. The advancement of medical science has created all sorts of issues with property rights that affect patients. And the final thing we're going to be looking at the practical level is disability rights. So this is the deal. For the longest time, medical ethics wasn't something that people thought about. Doctors were authority figures, and you just did what doctors said. And so back in the time of Henrietta Lacks, when her tissues were taken, it was the 1950s, and you just did what doctors say. Medical ethics became a thing starting in the 1970s. And there are a lot of reasons why suddenly people had to start worrying about specifically the ethics of medicine. There were dramatically improved technologies, especially regarding end-of-life care. So starting in the 70s, you had situations where people were on life support but completely unconscious, and you had to start asking about whether or not you wanted to pull the plug, right? Also, starting in the 70s, there was increased bureaucratic complexity of medicine. It used to be that you would just do what your doctor said, and for the most part, medicine was about a doctor-patient relationship, which was essentially a relationship between two individuals. But as the bureaucracy around medicine grows, you now have the way we experience medicine, which is not a doctor-patient relationship. It is a patient, hospital, insurance company, government, lawyer relationship. The other thing that happened in the 70s is there were a number of social movements that focused on patient autonomy. We'll talk about this soon. The disability rights movement was essentially a movement around patient autonomy. The right to die movement, which came up because now suddenly people were on life support but not living quality lives, came up. And that was essentially a movement based around patient autonomy. And the rights of experimental subjects, people who doctors were performing medical experiments on. All of this was extremely important. And a focus of this is something called the Tuskegee syphilis study. We'll have a whole class on that coming up. Okay. So we're talking about ethics. We're talking about ethics and medicine. One of the things that we need to think about, though, is what we mean when we say ethics. And you probably have all sorts of associations with the word ethics. But there's a crucial distinction that I want to make between what we call descriptive ethics and normative ethics. And we're going to be doing both of these in this class. So one way you might want to talk about ethics is just to describe existing moral views and practices. So you might say that amongst conservative Christians, abortion is considered immoral. That is a description of how a group of people approach medicine, one aspect of medicine. Normative ethics is what comes up when you actually have to ask yourself, what should I do? So when you actually ask yourself, is it moral for me to have an abortion? Now you're engaging in ethics normatively. You're not just describing what people believe, you're thinking about what you should do. And it's important to note that when in a philosophical ethics class like this one, we're going to engage in normative ethics. We aren't just talking about what some people think is right and wrong. I actually want to give you the chance to think about what you think is right and wrong. So in many cases, you're going to have an instinct to say, well, it all depends on what your opinion is. And my answer to that is always going to be, well, what's your opinion? That is the thing that's relevant here. And you can't escape normative ethics in medicine. Once you enter into a hospital or a clinic, you are confronted with moral choices that you have to make. And as a result, you can't say, well, it depends on your opinion. You have to start thinking, well, what is my opinion? And of course, I'm not here to foist any opinion off on you. I am here to help you think through your own opinions. So I mentioned previously that there are some big philosophical concepts that are floating around that are going to be crucial for this course. And one of them is the idea of autonomy. Autonomy is your right to control your own life. And in Western bioethics, and bioethics as it's practiced in Europe and America and several other wealthy countries, autonomy is one of the central concepts in medical ethics. Your right to control your own life. And understanding what autonomy means, when you have autonomy, what autonomy covers, is one of the central questions of this class. So we're going to say that you are in control of your life if you are free of external constraints, and also if you are free of internal constraints. Let me talk about what this means. External constraints are easy enough to understand. If you are locked in a room, your autonomy has been taken away by something external to you. Someone locked you in a room, right? If you are in a hospital and you have been restrained because some doctor thought you were a threat, and so you've been put in a restraining chair, you've lost autonomy. That's freedom of external constraints. Freedom from internal constraints is more complicated, but in some ways far more important. We say that you are autonomous if you are making decisions for yourself. If you are simply behaving randomly or erratically, you no longer have self-control. For instance, suppose you are addicted and you do things to feed your addiction that you don't want to do on some level, but you've lost control of yourself. Addiction is a kind of internal constraint on your autonomy. And we're not going to talk too much about addiction, but we are going to talk about other things that happen that reduce your ability to control yourself, especially at the end of life, as for instance, if you develop Alzheimer's disease, right, you are losing the capacity to control yourself. And in that sense, you are no longer free of internal constraints. So we say that autonomy is your right to control your own life. We're going to say that competence is your ability to control your own life without internal constraints. So if you are free of these internal constraints, you are competent. Once you are competent, we want to say that other people have to respect that and grant you control over your own life. So in medical ethics, a crucial thing happens at the end of life, happens at the end of everyone's life, is a decline in mental competence. And at some point, because of your decline in mental competence, someone else has to start making decisions for you because you are no longer in control of yourself. Autonomy in this sense is a normative concept. It's about what you should do and how other people should treat you. Competence is a descriptive concept. It's just about what you are able to do. So again, there's an important distinction constantly between the normative and the descriptive that is running throughout what we're doing. And I like to emphasize this difference the whole time. So we said normative ethics is about what you really should do, whereas descriptive ethics is just about describing how other people decide to live their lives. In general, normativity is, any statement is normative if it's a should statement. And descriptive statements are is statements. The world is divided between is and ought. And all the time you have to be thinking about whether you're thinking about the way things ought to be or the way things are. And of course, to make competent ethical decisions, you need to be thinking about both of those. So that's autonomy. I also want to talk about justice. Justice is a crucial ethical concept. And in philosophy, we actually use a fairly abstract notion of justice. It's easy enough to say that justice is fairness. But we also want to talk about moral consistency, treating similar cases similarly. This is an old idea of justice. It goes back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. The idea is that if two people give me the same test, let's just talk about fairness and grading. Justice and grading is an intuitive concept for any student to grasp. Two people give me the same test. They answered all the questions the same way. Those tests are similar. I should give them similar grades. If I don't treat similar tests similarly, I'm being unfair. If I say this person gets an A because they donated money to the college, this person gets a B, even though they turned in basically the same test because they didn't donate money to the college, that's being unfair because the cases themselves are similar. That's a core notion of justice. We're going to be returning to it again and again as we go along. The problem is that in order to decide what is just in any given context, you need to decide what counts as similar. So in my test example, I said that if you turn in tests that have basically the same answers on them, and it's not so similar that it looks like you cheated, but they're basically the same kind of test, we see that that's relevantly similar. Whereas the fact that one person donated money to the college and another person did not, that doesn't count as something that's relevant to what's going on. I wouldn't say everyone who donates the same amount of money to the college gets the same grade. That would not be justice. Even though there's a similarity there, it's not a relevant similarity. So one of the things that's also going to happen here, because we're talking, when we move from the big philosophical level of justice and autonomy down to the practical level, we're going to start encountering racism. Racism is part of injustice, and there's going to be a variety of ways that this injustice happens. So this is more of a political distinction, but we're going to need to keep it in mind as we go through the story of Henrietta Lacks, because we're going to see all of these things at play. The most obvious form of racism is just conscious prejudice, and this also applies to sexism and prejudice against the disabled, any kind of prejudice. It can be conscious. You could say, I hate those people. This is actually the rarest form of racism or sexism or other kinds of prejudice, because people don't like to admit that they're prejudiced. Normally, biases, unjust attitudes are implicit or unconscious. So implicit bias is unconscious beliefs or attitudes about a group that impact behavior. So if I implicitly think that women tend to be more nurturing than men and therefore should have a bigger role in child rearing, that might be an implicit unconscious belief, but it's going to change my behavior towards women. That's an implicit bias. That's far more common. The deepest level of injustice, whether you're talking about racism or sexism or bias against the disabled or any other kind of bias, is going to be what we call structural injustice. Structural injustices are unjust situations that are a result of social structures that many people participate in. Now we've moved away from one person's attitudes, either conscious or unconscious, and towards the whole way society is organized. And right away in the book we're reading, we're going to start seeing examples of injustice that are not related to individual attitudes, conscious or unconscious. They are built into the structure of society. Next steps. If you go to the Canvas page for this course, you can see that we are here. We just watched the video Bioethics through Henrietta Lacks. The next thing that happens is you need to download the review sheet. Hang on to that, keep that. Take your notes on that review sheet, because that's going to help you with the quizzes and that sort of thing. And then next up, after that, we're going to be actually, I would like you to sit down and read the first 26 pages of the book, this book here. So download the review sheet, read the first 26 pages of the book, watch the video where Skloot describes how she recreates historical events. Because when you start reading this book, you're going to say, holy cow, she's given me an incredible amount of detail for an event that happened in the 1950s, 70 years ago. How did she do that? She'll tell you. And then finally, we've got an exercise entitled Meet the Characters. And then after that, there's another video. So that's what we're up to. Great. Look forward to seeing you again.